All right, we have a very special guest today on the Manipulation Check. We have with us Laura Dodsworth, author, journalist, photographer, filmmaker, and the author of A State of Fear, How the UK Government Weaponized Fear During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And am I correct? Is it a bestseller? Sunday Times bestseller, is that correct?
It was indeed. It was on the Sunday Times bestseller list for 4 weeks. It sold well.
So best-selling.
Maybe not on your side of the pond. It's definitely had more of an international focus and audience.
Right. All right. So best-selling. We'll change it to best-selling author.
A State of Fear by Laura Dodsworth, a Sunday Times bestseller.
So Laura, you wrote this fantastic book, and in your book, you write about these nudge units, these behavioral change units in the UK. What brought you to the point of investigating these nudge units during the pandemic?
It feels already like quite a long time ago to explain the background, because I feel like pre-COVID and lockdown Laura doesn't exist. That world doesn't exist. I don't want to launch straight from your first question into an existential crisis, and yet here I am. I think there's a few reasons why I wrote this book. First of all, it was such a shocking thing to happen. You know, the pandemic itself, but most importantly for me, the government's response to it and the way governments across the world fell like dominoes. And it's hard not to overstate this. The world's never done anything like it before. Mm-hmm. And when I'm interested in something, when I'm really interested, I will research it deeply. And so, sure, from my armchair expert perspective, I started researching viruses, epidemics, pandemic management. And some of the data I found and the perspectives I was hearing gave me a more reassuring sense of context than what we were hearing in mainstream media and from some of our public health and government officials. And so the decision to lock down gave me this whiplash of shock and also fear. And at that point, it wasn't really fear about the virus, although I had a little bit of that. It was more fear of what we were going to do to ourselves socially and economically. It was obvious to me that this would tank the economy. We've been quantitative easing in this country, and I'm sure it's the same in the US and Canada, since the financial crisis of 2008. It was obvious we were going to quantitative ease the crap out of this as well. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, where's this going to go? High inflation, hyperinflation, what are we doing? I mean, I've only got A-level economics and I know that. Surely the Chancellor of the Exchequer knows this. I was really profoundly affected by how people behaved with each other right at the beginning of the pandemic, and then when the lockdown started. People were very fearful outside, even in the outdoors. You know, they didn't want to be anywhere near you. They'd spring to the other side of the pavement and kind of turn their head away from you and really seem irritated if you were too close. So we went from a world where, at least where I live, the absolute default is that you greet people and you smile and you say something, especially if you're dog walkers, to acting as though people were dangerous and annoying. Everything changed so much. And I was interested in the virus and interested in what was happening and worried about it. But I tuned into the fear. And I think I did that because I'm just interested in what makes us who we are as human beings. So one question I've been asked as well in interviews is, well, how did you go from photographing and interviewing people about breasts, penises and vulvas to this? Like, really, what are your credentials? And there's a review of the book, actually, in the Times that calls me a pudender artist. It's obviously supposed to be the ultimate demeaning insults that a pudender artist would dare to write a polemical, psychological book. But really, I think what's at the heart of it all is that interest in the taboo, in those deep drives, what makes us who we are, behave the way we do. And it seemed to me that the really big story was the fact that people were frightened, but governments were deliberately trying to make us more frightened. Mm-hmm. It struck me really early that the language from our statesmen was very martial, very extreme, very fear-mongering, very authoritarian. We had lots of ad campaigns, etc. We can go into the techniques more later if you want. And I thought that the enduring story is the story about fear and psychology, because the epidemic will come and go. You know, we're already talking in various places around the world about how we're reaching endemic status. But our psychology is here to stay. And so, in a way, this is why I said I've got a kind of an existential crisis. I've never thought so much about what makes us who we are, about our flaws, our strengths, our ingenuity, our frailty. And the real crisis bit stems from the fact that I thought life was a certain way and my relationship with the government was of a certain nature before lockdown. And what I realised is that government is government, and it will govern you if it wants to. So I had this illusion of agency, but it was an illusion, because if it was snatched away so easily, it wasn't real. It's precarious. I thought we invested our authority in government, and I still say this because I'm determined to believe it's true and to work towards it. But actually, we were seeing that democracy turns on a dime, just instantly, overnight, and that people want it. And so the world we lived in before it's just not there anymore. And I found myself a new person in a new world with a new understanding of people. Massive long answer to your question. Sorry.
Yeah, your experience mirrors, I think, my experience and maybe Jeff's as well. In this recognition that things aren't exactly as you thought they were, and that government's maybe behaving in a way that you wouldn't expect them to. Now, somewhere along the way, you came across Spyby, which is this UK unit, I guess part of the scientific pandemic influenza group on behavior. And you were able to interview some of these Spyby advisors. Can you tell us about Spyby, what they are exactly, and what you learned from some of these advisors?
Of course. Yes. So in the UK, there's a group of experts that feeds into the government on various emergencies. That's called SAGE. And sounds very wise. Big group of wise men, obviously, with an acronym like that. And then there are various subgroups that feed into SAGE. I think it's called the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies. And one of those subgroups is the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour. So that's a group of social scientists, behavioural scientists, psychologists, anthropologists who exist to answer the government's questions. And to start with, who they were was a secret. We were told that was for their interests of security, but obviously there's something that's uncomfortable about that. If there are people who are advising the government on matters of such importance, we need to know who they are as well. So their names were revealed. That's how I was able to approach them and ask them to be interviewed. But it wasn't a secret that Spyby exists. I think that it's COVID that's put them on the radar. We now know about Spyby because of the pandemic, but they've always been there. And I expect people who understand how Whitehall works and how emergencies work and have done other disasters already knew about them. So the minutes from the meetings weren't initially published, but then the government responded to requests and demands really from the media and the demos that we wanted to see the minutes of the meetings. And so there was a very extraordinary set of minutes that were published on March the 22nd, I think. I'm trying to remember. Yes, the 22nd. And
is that 2020?
2020, yes. So this is right at the outset. It's on the 23rd that our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, told the nation that we must stay at home. They said we were on lockdown. In fact, we weren't. Legally, we weren't locked down until the 26th of March, but they just said we were and pretended we are. We had a 3-day legal fiction. So those minutes were published in May, but they were first written on the 22nd of March. When they were published, I just thought it was one of the most extraordinary documents ever to be revealed to the British public. Because the question was obviously, how do we get the public to agree to lockdown? How do we get them to follow the rules? And that's what they're answering. And there are various suggestions, there's a suite of suggestions in the minutes, but one of them was that people's sense of perceived threat needed to be raised because some people understood the risk to their own demographic group. You see, back then, those close to the data or anyone who'd cared to research it like I had, knew that there was already a staggered risk according to age and according to your clinical condition. We weren't all equally at risk, but the Spyby members felt that meant that the population might not adhere en masse to the rules because we knew we weren't equally at risk. So they suggested increasing the sense of personal threat. Quite literally, they suggested that we should be scared in order to follow the rules. And that's partly what started this whole journey for me. And I met my publisher actually to pitch a completely different book. And he said, "Oh, what else are you up to?" And I said, "I'm going to write an article about how the government's weaponised fear, about how it's using fear to make people follow the rules." And he said, "Wow, that sounds really interesting. Do you think that could be a book?" I was like, no, it's just an article. I want to get on with
There's
this.
not enough there to make it a book. Right?
Yeah. And he said, "Well, what about a short book, 30,000 words?" It's like, maybe. I left really reluctant because I really wanted to get on with my next book, which is about death. And I was almost as soon as I got in the car, I thought, wow, you know what? I have actually got a lot of material already. Let's go. And it was so fascinating. It's one of the most disturbing, uncomfortable, but fascinating things I've ever done. I think I can honestly say it's at once the worst and the best thing I've done. A bit like birth, right? You end up with a baby, which is amazing, but you go through about 2 days of eye tearing out torture to get there, and that's what this book was like, actually.
So it was a pretty kind of punctuated but gradual process where you were aware of these things, you were paying attention to them. The minutes came out, you're very much attuned to them, and then you started digging even deeper into
yes.
into
So yes, I never finished answering your question about the nudge units. So I just emailed everybody on the Spyby list. Their names are published. I looked them up. They're mainly academics, so you can just go to the university where they work, find the email address, and email them. I emailed all of them, apart from a couple who I could see wouldn't be of interest, because they were too peripheral in their social science for this book. And several of them responded to say they would agree to be interviewed. And I thought, right, great, that's a start. And then actually, the UK government website does publish at least spare details of different units of government. So Spyby are voluntary advisors. They do this because it's, it's for the national interest. It's probably really interesting, career-defining work, and I'm sure it's very good for their professional profiles or academic profiles and encouraging more research funding. They don't get paid by the government to do it. They're free agents. But there are specific units within the government, embedded within the government, dedicated to behavioural science. So there's one that's called colloquially the Nudge Unit. That's actually the Behavioural Insights Team. That was set up in 2010. And it's now an independent unit, but up until December 2021, it was 1/3 owned by the Cabinet Office and UK government, 1/3 owned by the directors of the Behavioural Insights Team, and 1/3 owned by an organisation called Nesta. And that has broad framework contracts within government. It looks like they're in and out of number 10 all the time. It actually originated as something called the Strategy Policy Unit. I think I've got that slightly wrong, but basically they're strategic advisors. So they're very close to government and what they do is behavioural science. And it's great to look at their website. I mean, I find it fascinating. They don't publish the results of much of what they do, unfortunately, but they do publish their documents pronouncing what they do. So very interesting to get an insight into how they think. There are other units as well within the government. There's the Counter Disinformation Cell and the Rapid Response Unit. I think they're both quite interesting. The work they do seems to overlap, but one thing they do is ask the big tech companies, social media companies, to take down misinformation. Now that could be legal, but considered harmful. They have kind of a hotline into the big tech companies, and they work to respond to misinformation online, I think, with individual people and in groups, but they're not transparent about how they work. We don't know exactly. One of the ministers in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport referred to the units in the House of Commons recently and quite amusingly called them the disinformation and misinformation units, which did make me chuckle. I don't think that's how they're supposed to be referred to, but it was acknowledged that they speak to big tech every week and get content taken down. So That's also, a form of propaganda or behavioural science, perhaps. And then there are behavioural scientists who are employed directly in different government departments. In the Treasury, there are 54 behavioural scientists.
Wow.
And then they're also employed in agencies, so the National Health Service, the Health and Safety Executive, DEFRA. There are and in local governments, there are behavioural scientists everywhere. It's like a hydra.
In your book, you use the term psychocrats. Are these psychocrats?
Yeah, unofficially,
psychocrat?
I made up that term, and then I was a bit disappointed to find out somebody else had made it up before me. When you think you've come up with something really witty and descriptive, and then you find out you're not as original as you thought. It's that. Well, you've probably heard the term technocracy, technocrats. So I think I think you could argue there is a move in governments towards a more technocratic style of government where, well, for instance, we follow the science, that those who know best move us around like pieces on a chessboard according to what's considered best for society. And there's a way in which I think behavioural science is quite a dangerous part of that, which is why I call them psychocrats. Because when they try to change your mind, your attitude, your behaviour, but without you knowing, there's something that's quite insidious about that. It's a subliminal. It's a type of subliminal behaviour change. It works below your level of consciousness, so you're not really aware of it. Which means that although I said before we invest our authority in government, how much do we when we've been influenced so much against, without our knowledge? So yeah, I call the behavioural scientists who are at the heart of government psychocrats. I see them as part of a technocratic shift in government that's moving us away from a democratic form of government.
So these psychocrats, do you think, well, based on the ones you interviewed, are they proud of what they're doing? Or are they also recognizing, what we're doing is maybe not great. It's got some problems.
I think there was a real mix. Also, first of all, the ones who didn't respond to my requests for interview are most of the members of Spyby. I also didn't manage to secure an interview with anybody in the Nudge unit, the Behavioural Insights team. So what they really think, I couldn't tell you. There's a chapter in my book dedicated to those interviews with Spyby members. Now, some of them are anonymous so that they could speak completely freely, and some of them are named. I sense that overall there is a feeling that they're doing good work, it's important work. One believed that the use of fear was quite acceptable because pandemics are a fearful time. But also at the same time, this person also acknowledged they themselves were quite neurotic about infection and the pandemic, and could acknowledge that, and even say that psychologists are quite neurotic in general, but didn't distinguish between whether they were making the rest of the population more neurotic than they needed to be, and if that's ethical or not. I mean, for instance, one thing I'd asked them about, which I thought was an important ethical consideration, was had they been tasked with how to de-escalate fear when the time came? Because
yes,
they'd discussed raising our sense of threat, which creates, stress. There are psychological and physical effects from stress, and would, affect society. It can make recovery harder. This is something I warned about in my book, and lo and behold, I think we're at that stage where some people are finding it hard to let go because they were scared beyond the scale of the threat for themselves. No, they had not been tasked with thinking about that. And they all seemed surprised, actually, to be asked, apart from one who's an educational psychologist called Gavin Morgan. And he had advised against quite a few of the measures that ended up being brought in, such as shutting schools, masking school children, for very valid educational psychology reasons, that it would inhibit communication, learning, social development, especially in younger children. And also he made the point to me, it is easy to shut a school and it will be very hard to reopen it, because just the nature of shutting it and the kind of work you have to do to soften people up for that sort of policy means that people will be frightened to reopen, and that extended to the teachers and the parents, let alone the pupils. Whether other people on Spyby had those same concerns, I don't know, because I didn't interview them. However, really very few people have spoken out publicly about those ethical considerations. There's a retired NHS psychologist here who wrote to the British Psychological Society to say that he believed that the code of ethics had been breached, and they didn't agree.
Wow. Yeah,
What's your view as psychologists?
Yeah, well, we've been on the show actually reviewing some of the academic papers, because very early on in the pandemic, there were some papers published by behavioral scientists, and they basically made the case for using various behavioral modification techniques. And in fact, fear was one of them. It was discussed in one of the Nature human behavior papers, one of these ones with 40 plus authors on them. And we, I think, would have very similar types of concerns, right? Because what you're talking about is essentially population-wide behavioral control, and a lot of that has to depend on decisions that have to do with ethics, right? What is the right thing to do? And I think there's this assumption out there that science will tell us that, but I think that science can't tell us all of that, nor can science really work that as quickly as people want it to. So especially in terms of understanding what we know about, the virus itself and even how it spreads and so on, people were very confident early on with what they knew, and it turns out maybe they were overconfident, and maybe some of those initial confident truths turn out to have been maybe incorrect. So, yeah, this idea that you just kind of that the behavioral science community eagerly committed their tools to this cause without maybe the foresight, because in those papers, that's one thing we also didn't read, Jeff. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we didn't ever read recommendations on how to then get out of all of this. How do you calm people down after you freak them out?
Yeah, if we think about it, even from the context of like an academic setting where people would run studies and you use manipulations and you manipulate emotions and things like that, it's very standard ethical protocol to have like a debrief. And I think you even mentioned this in your book about how you'd have, let's say you're to induce a certain emotion, run somebody through a study, then you'd have some kind of offset or counter to that emotion to make that emotion go away. So they're leaving the study in the same state they were when they came into the study.
Yes. So you just said that more academically than me, but in my book I said if this was a lab experiment, I would have had to consent to it, first of all. I've never consented to behavioural scientists sneakily changing my behaviour without me knowing. I've never consented to them frightening me. And I said, I'd have expected to be shown a rom-com and have a slice of chocolate cake before I leave the lab. And nobody planned the rom-com or the chocolate cake. There's none. There's nothing.
Yeah.
It's just left. In fact, the way out of this, the way I'm seeing it play out is a form of kind of subtle gaslighting. As they kind of say, well, oh no, the people in hospital, some of them are there incidentally with COVID. And, or, some of those people who died, well, they died with COVID, not of COVID. Things they could have said right at the beginning, but they didn't, because the big numbers were useful at the beginning. And at the end, the only way to then chip away at that is to kind of subtly undermine how you thought about it. It's the same kind of thing with Partygate here. You probably know about the Downing Street parties. Yeah. And ministers saying, oh, well, how could he possibly have known there was anything wrong with that? Whereas it was made very clear to people at the time exactly what would have been wrong with that. There was no room for doubt. Nobody thought they could be having little birthday parties. So there's kind of a subtle gaslighting to undo the fear, which I think, again, is really quite insidious and egregious.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the government will ever come out and actually apologize, or these behavioral scientists? Do you think they ever will, and would that help? Would it help for them to say, we kind of overdid it and we're sorry?
No, I don't think they'll ever do it. No, I don't.
Okay.
Because first of all, they bought into it themselves. The other thing I'd say about the behavioural scientists is they do not question the ingests. So they're shown modelling, 500,000 people will die if we do nothing, or this many people will die if we do something. They don't question that, and that's not their job to question it. I think they're quite a credulous and accepting bunch, to be perfectly honest.
Yes. So they just accepted the narrative.
Yeah, and you see, that wouldn't be in my nature. I'd want to interrogate each part of it, and awkward like that. And I think that they just accept it. One of them, in fact, when I said, have you been tasked with how we'll get back to normal? And he seemed shocked. Like, well, what do you mean? We've got the biggest crisis coming up, the climate crisis. The idea that they would interrogate the nature of anthropogenic climate change, if they haven't interrogated very flawed mathematical modelling to project deaths from a pandemic, which never really even took human behaviour into account.
Mm-hmm. So you're seeing maybe that they might use the same techniques and apply them to other issues to change our behaviour with regard to other issues like climate change, for instance.
Oh, I don't need to say that. There are plenty of reports from the Behavioural Insights team and from academics in this country about how they should even use the window of opportunity from COVID, where habits are malleable, in order to change people's habits towards net zero climate goals. And the Behavioural Insights team website has a number of reports about how to use behavioural science to affect climate change goals. And of course, most people go, well, that's good, because we need to save the planet. We're in crisis. But this is also part of what happens if you don't question those data ingests.
Yes.
And question what the right tactics are in order to go about it. I feel like the ethical considerations are just gone, and I don't think the enactors of the policy will ever apologise for it either. Can I say one more thing about Spyby just quickly before we move on? I really want to make this point. It's important that actually some of the most severe criticism of the government comes from the anonymous Spyby advisors that I interviewed for the book. Mm-hmm. One who said that the use of fear was dystopian.
Mm-hmm. Dystopian.
Dystopian. And the subtitle of the book, How the UK Government Weaponised Fear During the COVID-19 Pandemic, which nearly gave my publisher a stroke when he saw it on the draft manuscript. Mm-hmm. That came from somebody who works in Whitehall, who said to me they were disgusted by how psychology was weaponised against the British people now. Mm-hmm. So I didn't even coin that myself. Some of the worst criticism came from people who are close to the government. They said that the nature of behavioural science has changed, whereas it used to be about anticipating how people would behave in a crisis or a disaster. It became about shaping the behaviour rather than just anticipating it. And they felt there was something that was wrong about that, and they weren't allowing normal, spontaneous human behaviour.
Would you say then that, if anything, rather than an apology, would you say that these units and these behavioral scientists are, if anything, emboldened based on the COVID response and maybe how successful it was?
100%. Yeah, I'm afraid so. One of my anonymous sources I went back to after the book to follow up with an article about what was going to ensue, and they told me there was skipping in the corridors in Whitehall. They think they've been a marvellous success. And
wow.
Yeah, I mean, well, this question was put to Spyby. How do we encourage adherence to the lockdown? Because they didn't think people would do it, and we did. And it's really interesting the way they talked about this. We've never told people, this is what somebody said to me, we've never told people not to go to football or go to the pub before. Like they see, British people as kind of working class oiks who aren't going to survive without their pint and their football. That's like, the stupid masses that aren't going to be able to follow the sensible rules because they've got to hang on to their primitive pastimes. That's how it sounded. And in fact, I think it's because they consistently underestimate people. I think people we know that people adapted their behaviour before there were any legal mandates. They shielded if they were clinically vulnerable, they changed their behaviour. I have a feeling you wouldn't even need to apply limits on big gatherings, that it would be an organic, spontaneous response. People would just probably not go to Wembley. And if they did, they'd go in such small numbers, they'd be so spaced out, it wouldn't matter. It's just my opinion, because actually I trust people, I trust humanity, I trust individuals to do the right thing for themselves and for each other. I'm sure that we've evolved to do that, but they didn't trust us to do it. Mm-hmm. And they went so far, they hit us with a sledgehammer of fear. Fear was an open door. Being told that there's a dangerous pandemic coming and seeing other countries shut down started something. We were changing our own behaviour. So if fear was an open door, what they did was take a battering ram to it, and they didn't need to. And now they can't shut the door.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you're concerned now that they've learned that they could use these behavioral control techniques, that they'll use them in the future, particularly also with the rise of this capacity for technocracy, in the sense that you can now measure behavior and compliance and such things essentially on the fly. So it seems like it's a very unique time in history right now. They've discovered, hey, we have these tools that we can use to control people's behavior, and we can also collect data as we're doing it to feed back. And in fact, there are a number of papers, and we've talked about some of these before on the show, where research scientists have actually been collecting data about people's responses and their views with regard to the pandemic and the behavior requirements and so on. And they use those to then hone the messaging and to make it more precise to be able to change their behavior. So there's this, it seems like a loop now that has a feedback capacity in real time. What do you think about that? Are you concerned about this?
Hugely concerned. And I've suggested that we have an inquiry into the government's deployment of behavioural science. It's one thing private companies using behavioural science, but this isn't a transactional relationship I've ever agreed to with my government. I mean, I thought naively they have a manifesto, I vote for them based on their good ideas, and then they enact them. But that's not what's happening. We voted them in, and then they're trying to change what our ideas are. And like you say, it all happens in real time in this kind of negative/positive feedback loop. I think it's really dangerous. I couldn't drum up any interest in the idea of an inquiry. I think what we have to do is increase people's personal sense of agency. This data comes from obviously our use of technology, social media, how we interact with the media. I think that people really have to use all of this extremely mindfully and on the highest privacy settings. I think that once people have seen the smoke and mirrors, they don't go back and they don't unsee it. I get messages from people all the time who've read the book to say it's changed how they see the world, how they see propaganda, how they see media. So I think once you've had your eyes open, you're good. It's just a question of helping people with that agency, because actually those of us who want people to be able to make informed individual decisions free from manipulation, those of us who have that conscious objective, I believe that sadly we're in a minority at the moment, because a lot of people are unaware. I just think it's terribly useful. Look at the attitude towards something like zero COVID. You know, people have wanted to wipe out a virus. Now you can either do that right at the beginning, or you're never going to do it. And there are still people talking about zero COVID. It's like a form of medical imperialism. And they'd be quite happy to foist these really onerous interventions on us, like social distancing and masking, forever. One of the Spyby advisors, Susan Mickey, said on TV in an interview that we would have to have social distancing maybe forever. And think, are you completely mad? I'm not doing it forever. Oh, and by the way, I've actually already stopped. You know, but there are people who think that's okay in pursuit of their lofty goals of what would make us model citizens and the world better in their eyes, because they have values that they place above liberty and free choice and informed consent decisions. So I don't see it going anywhere. I think the thing to work at is people's own agency.
So some of what you said really seems to me like it speaks to some of the philosophical foundations of nudge itself, with respect to how the view of people with respect to their limitations around rationality and around making decisions for themselves, and the importance of having certain experts help them along with their decisions.
Me being aware that you're both psychologists, you're probably better able to answer this than me, but I think there is something there. I mean, some of the techniques they're just not consensual because they're covert. And it's made me feel uncomfortable about the government's use of nudge at all. Now, other people have said to me, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Behavioural science isn't all bad. Perhaps at the moment I'm in a kind of an extreme reactive state where I'm seeing more of the negative aspects than the positive. But there were just so many non-consensual techniques used upon us that I'm not comfortable with, that I don't see fitting into a democratic society. So things like, let's let's just say the vaccine passports as well, because there's a decision that everyone should be vaccinated. Suddenly, you know, we think we're living in a society where the backbone of medical ethics is informed consent, but the vaccine passport undermines that completely, because you don't have access to some aspects of civil, social, or economic life unless you're vaccinated. So that's the coercion. And then on the plus side, on the carrot side, not the stick side, there were all these incentives for the vaccine, which they seem more overt. I mean, I never thought we'd see anything like that. I could never have dreamt that would be happening in 2022. And the behavioural scientists think it's great. I don't know if you've heard Thaler and Sunstein and read their papers on it. You know, they're huge fans of this. And I think they're unable personally to separate not just this kind of medical imperialist attitude, but maybe also their own fear of infection from, and I'm hypothesizing, I don't know what's really going on with them, but can they not separate their own fear maybe from the tactics that they're suggesting? Because I don't see how these fit into a healthy democratic society.
It seems to me like the whole concept of nudge was kind of a foot in the door technique by the behavioral scientists, because the basic idea that Thaler and Sunstein point out is that they're just helping people do what those people would want to do if they didn't have any limitations, right? So it's like the consent is almost implied because you're just helping people do what they would want to do in the first place. But then somehow it's like that's not always clear. And now they have to infer what people would want to have been doing or would want to do. And sometimes they don't seem to get that quite right, or they assume that they always get it right, which they might not. And then it slightly shifts into more of a, rather than this kind of a nudge, to like a full-on push, even though people don't want to do exactly what they want them to do. So it just seems like it's all called nudge now, but but the whole thing went from kind of helping people do what they want to full-on coercion.
And that's a really good point. And it's a point I've made as well. When do they stop nudging? Now, it should be a nudge to help you in the direction of what you apparently would do for yourself if you could just stop and take the time out of your busy life to make the correct rational decision, right? Because we're also thick and irrational. And then you don't do that. So, I'll give you another nudge. Don't follow that nudge. Well, now it's time for some coercion, and then it's time for some punishment. The nudge doesn't stop. It's not actually a nudge. And I think there's some research on this. I've seen a paper recently, I'm afraid I can't remember the authors now, the title of it, basically saying that if you know that a nudge is being deployed, it's becoming a turn-off because you're seeing it as the first step of a policy that's unavoidable. It's like an early warning system, and that's I can feel that myself, because I don't believe anymore in the nudge. It's not a nudge, it's a series of interventions until I do exactly what they want me to do.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, that makes me dig my heels in right at the beginning.
Yeah.
It's like with the vaccine passports. I decided I would absolutely never, ever, ever use a vaccine passport. Bad luck. I think it's a really horrible vision of society. Horrible that people who haven't accepted a certain medicine can't go into a restaurant or work or go on holiday. And I thought, well, that's it. This is such an unpleasant vision of society that I can't take part in it. And you know what? Maybe if I really understood the reason for it and you'd convinced me and it was a decision of informed consent, maybe I would. But the fact that you're trying to nudge me time after time to do it is so insidious. And we're going to end up in this two-tier world that I can't condone. So if I have to die on that hill, unvaccinated, it's what I'll do. And I'll never be vaccinated. I think ultimately some of these policies, while they've created the net shift in behaviour that can make them say it's worked, and they can justify their salary, I think they'll have created a cohort of people that are extra resistant to nudge, and also they'll have created a cohort of people who are extremely vaccine hesitant now. I see this as being very undermining to long-term trust in public health. That's my gut instinct. I can't say I've got any evidence to back that up, but my gut instinct is that if you were going to be vaccinated, that early nudge might have given you a push. Oh, what, you're going to pay for my taxi to get there? Great, because that was my problem. My problem was convenience. Or, oh, I was definitely going to be vaccinated, and now you've said you're going to give me a free pizza. I'm there today. And then there would be people who were thinking, well, I'm not really sure. I want to see more data. You, excuse me? And a college education? No, thank you. Why do you need to dangle a college education in front of me to get a simple vaccine? That sounds highly suspicious. And then, what, a vaccine passport? I can't work unless I have it. Well, I didn't think I wanted it, and now I really don't want it. You see, if you were going to have it anyway, the nudge is just a really quick, immediate net shift. But I think there's going to be a swathe of people who would probably become more entrenched in their behaviour as a result of the nudging.
Now, do you see a connection between nudge and propaganda? Or do you see propaganda playing a role in nudge?
So that one of the founders of the behavioural insights team, called Simon Ruder, wrote a piece in January 22 where he refers to nudge and propaganda. The timing of it is interesting. He could have said the things he said at any point during the lockdown. I don't think I buy that his realisations only came in January 22. However, the sale of the behavioural insights team went through in December 21. And of course, the shareholders will have made a lot of money out of that. And I assume that as a former director, he's a shareholder. But I'm just guessing, I don't know, because he didn't answer any of the questions I put to him. Anyway, he said that it had become apparent that while nudge is a force for good, it's also, it can be used for propaganda. I don't think I'll have his quote to hand, but it was an interesting admission of the link between nudge and propaganda. I think you could talk about that all day. I mean, obviously they're different things. Nudge isn't propaganda and propaganda isn't nudge, but I think they're used by the same people for the same reasons.
And certainly the messages that are used to nudge can be framed in a way, because if they're trying to change your behavior, you could say that they are propagandistic messages, I suppose.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to backpedal on that. I think propaganda has very specifically been wielded for nudge purposes. So Sunstein wrote about how we needed vivid but truthful depictions of the unvaccinated's regret, because they wanted to get younger people to be vaccinated against COVID. And, articles were unleashed across the world of young people in hospitals saying they regretted not being vaccinated. Now, the use of personal stories towards a political goal, because the vaccination goals, you call them public health, but they're also tied in with political goals, is propaganda. Even if they were truthful, even if these are real people and not paid crisis actors, then it's propaganda. So yeah, I think propaganda has quite specifically been used. The nudgers might not see it as propaganda. They think they're probably just holding up cautionary tales to make us recalcitrant, stupid children do what we should have done already. But there was something that was it didn't really work very well, because all these young people were supposed to believe that they were otherwise normally fit and healthy. I didn't see anyone that wasn't obese, for instance. You couldn't. There weren't many young and otherwise completely fit, healthy people who were in hospital bemoaning that they hadn't been vaccinated.
Well, statistically, that number would be so small that they would really have to search for these people. And then certainly because if you put them up and you essentially present them as an example of something that could happen or that's common, and that's not properly balanced, then I guess that would fall maybe under the definition of propaganda. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So that's one example I can think of. It's a great question. No one's asked me that before and I wasn't really prepared for it. But yes, I think it would be fair to say propaganda was used to nudge. I mean, some of the, I think some of the relationship with the media hints at that certain stories were very present in the media. And you get a sense that comes from relationships between politicians, public health people that are nudging these sorts of stories out there.
Jeff, we have time for one more question. Do you want to put one out there?
Well, I'll pose one and let me know if there's a better one, or we might want to go a different direction. But one of the things, because we've been really hammering nudge and hammering the nudgers. I was wondering, what would be your most generous read on these nudge units? Like if you were to have one, or if you'd be even comfortable proposing something like that, or speculating.
Oh, wow, that's literally the toughest question ever. A generous interpretation of nudge units. Woo.
Yeah. It might be bad for your book sales. I don't know.
No, it's not that makes me cautious. I really don't feel very generous towards government nudge units. I don't have an issue with nudge. I don't have an issue with it at all. All's fair in love and war. As long as it's by a supermarket or an FMCG brand, I don't think governments should be nudging. Of course, propaganda has always existed one way or another, as has nudge. And nudge quite often doesn't work. I think one reason the Behavioural Insights team don't publish all of their results is probably because some of them don't work very well. But I just think it's fundamentally wrong for a government to nudge its citizens without our consent or our knowledge. Of course, the problem is our consent and our knowledge would both work to undermine the work of the nudge, because it's supposed to work below the conscious level. But back when the nudge unit was created, there was a policy document written here in the UK that talked about the reciprocity in the relationship between people and government. We pay our taxes and the government provides services in return. And we know what those services are, but we've never talked about this behavioural science service. We've never signed up to it. So I can't really have a generous interpretation. I think that the behavioural scientists who are doing it believe they're acting with our best interests at heart. But I think that's also based on the fact that they think that they know better and that we're not rational. I also think we should be free to make the wrong decision. Now, I don't smoke before I say this, but if I want to look at that packet with some destroyed lungs on it and then still smoke, it's up to me. The taxes we pay more than cover the health service cost of it. I don't smoke. But if I did, it's up to me to smoke. And some of the best work I've created and some of the most transformational experiences I've had have come out of mistakes. I don't want to be a perfect model citizen. And if I'm going to be a model citizen, I want to define for myself what model is. So some of what they do, it looks like, you couldn't really have an argument with it. Oh, well, reducing obesity, cutting down smoking, reducing knife crime in city centres. These things all sound so good. But it's the thin end of the wedge. You talked about the foot in the door. I think you're right. Nudge was the foot in the door because it started off like that. And now it's not just locking up the biscuits tins, it's locking us up. There was a report recently from the Behavioural Insights team in collaboration with Sky, big licensed broadcaster. And it was about how to nudge viewers towards climate change behaviour. And I was just astonished reading it because it suggested things like news segments, how to weave characters and stories into soap operas and dramas, documentaries, children's programming to have spillover multi-generation effects. It even talked about product placement. And I don't think people are aware of how much mass media interventions are used in order to create behaviour change. Now, if many of the things that were in that report had actually been done by Sky and its programmers, and if we spotted it, we'd have grounds for an Ofcom complaint. But Ofcom works retrospectively, so even though I made a kind of preemptive complaint to Ofcom, there isn't anything to complain about yet. But how will we know when a news segment is created in order to push us towards climate change behaviour? How will we know if a character's driving a particular car and not another car because they want us to spot that it's an electric car? So I think they're very emboldened, and they do it because they believe there are policies that we must all work towards for the greater good. That's the most generous I can be, because I'm afraid at the same time, I don't think they question the ingests. I don't think they're working within a proper ethical framework, and I wouldn't trust them to create an ethical framework either. I mean, on the ingest, for instance, one of which is reducing obesity. Well, there are lots of different ideas about how you could reduce obesity. I would argue that we've had obesity in this country since we changed the dietary advice, which was to switch to eating more carbohydrates. I don't, unfortunately, trust the government or the behavioural scientists or the public health officials anywhere near our obesity targets. Don't think they know how to fix it. And I think that's quite often the case.
Yeah.
I wasn't very generous, was I? I didn't do very well at that.
That's pretty good. That's
yeah. I think maybe we agree that it's hard to be generous with the use of some of these behavioral nudges and the way that they've been deployed, especially during the pandemic. But maybe this is a good place to stop. Laura, thank you for this very engaging interview. And I just want to tell our listeners, here's the book. Look, I've got all these different marks in it because I've read it very carefully. It's a fantastic book. And if you want to learn about different kinds of nudges that have been deployed during the pandemic, and especially the focus on fear, this is the book to read. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really interesting, and how great that a bona fide psychologist left so many markers all the way through the book. Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks.